There is a particular kind of silence that follows destruction, not the peaceful kind. Not the silence of a calm evening or a quiet Sunday morning. This is the silence that fills a room after a door has been slammed so hard the walls shudder. The silence that wraps itself around your shoulders like cold air when you are standing outside in the dark, bag in hand, staring at a house that used to be yours, wondering how the world could look exactly the same when everything inside you has just collapsed. I know that silence well. I have lived inside it. My name is Nadia, and I want to tell you something. Before I begin, something I wish someone had told me on the night I stood on that pavement. 26 years old, hands shaking, eyes so swollen from crying I could barely see the streetlight flickering above me. I want to tell you that being thrown away does not make you garbage. Being discarded does not make you disposable. And the people who toss you aside, especially the ones who were supposed to love you, they almost never do it because of what you lack. They almost always do it because of what you have. What you know. What you are close to uncovering. But I didn't know any of that yet. On the night this story begins, I only knew one thing. I had just been thrown out of my own home. By my own husband. And I had no idea why. Let me take you back. Not to the night it happened. Not yet. First, I want you to understand who I was before. Because you cannot truly understand a fall unless you understand the height from which someone falls. And my life, by every visible measure, was a good one. I grew up in a mid-sized city in the South, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the summers are long and hot and the church parking lots are full on Sunday mornings. My parents were ordinary, decent people. My father worked as an electrician. My mother taught primary school. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable. We had a garden. We had Sunday dinners. We had the kind of home where the door was always unlocked and the kettle was always on. I was the middle child of 3. My older brother Daniel was steady and reliable, the kind of person who never raised his voice and always showed up on time. My younger sister Lily was bright and sharp and funny in a way that made you feel like the room was warmer when she walked in. And then there was me, somewhere in the middle in every sense. Not the boldest, not the quietest. Just Nadia, steady, thoughtful, the one who noticed things. That last part, the noticing, it would turn out to be the most important thing about me. And also, for a long time, the most dangerous. I met Marcus when I was 22. He was 28, already established, already sure of himself in a way that I found both impressive and magnetic. He worked in property development, not the flashy kind you see on television, but the quieter, more methodical kind. He bought old buildings, restored them, sold them. He had a gift for seeing potential in things other people had given up on. Or at least, that was the story he told. That was the version of himself he offered me, and I believed it entirely. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. Our wedding was small, 50 people, a venue by the river, my mother crying happy tears during the vows. It was a genuinely beautiful day. I remember standing at the altar looking at Marcus and thinking that I had been so lucky. That somehow out of all the directions life could have gone, it had delivered me here. To this man. To this moment, we moved into the house he owned on the north side of the city. A large Victorian terrace. Beautifully restored, with high ceilings and original fireplaces and a kitchen that opened out into a walled garden. It was the kind of house that people slow down to look at when they walk past. Marcus had done the restoration himself over 2 years before we met, and he was proud of it in a way that I found touching at first. He loved that house. What I did not fully appreciate in those early years was how much of that love was about ownership. About possession. About the very particular way Marcus related to things that he considered his. For the first 3 years, our marriage was good. Not perfect, no marriages, but genuinely good. We traveled. We built friendships. We talked about the future. Marcus was thoughtful in the way of someone who has learned to seem thoughtful. He remembered small details. He gave considered gifts. He asked questions that made you feel seen. And I did feel seen in those early years. I felt chosen, but there were moments. Small ones. easy to dismiss at the time. The way he would go quiet and unreachable after I disagreed with him in front of other people. The way he would redirect conversations when they got close to his finances. The way he sometimes looked at me just briefly, just for a flash, like I was something to be managed rather than loved. I noticed these things, and then I talked myself out of noticing them. Because when you love someone, that is what you do. You translate the things that trouble you into things that make sense. You smooth over the rough edges. You tell yourself that nobody is perfect, that every relationship has its friction, that what you have is real and worth protecting, and that the small shadows at the corners of it are just that, small, manageable, not worth dismantling everything over. I was wrong. The shadows were not small. I just couldn't see their full size yet. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong came 4 years into our marriage. On a Wednesday evening in October, I had come home early from work. I was a project manager for a mid-sized architectural firm, and a meeting had been canceled last minute, freeing up my afternoon. I let myself in, called out for Marcus, got no response. Assumed he was still at his office. Put the kettle on. Went into his study to leave a note on his desk. About dinner plans. His computer was open. I want to be clear about something. I was not snooping. I was not suspicious. I was not looking for anything. I was simply going to leave a note on his desk, and his computer was open and the screen was active, and what was on it stopped me cold. It was an email. From a solicitor I didn't recognize. Addressed to Marcus regarding what was described as, and I remember these words precisely, because they branded themselves into my memory, the transfer of beneficial ownership of the Ashworth Road property. I stood there for a long moment. Ashworth Road was not a property Marcus had ever mentioned. And in a marriage to a property developer, you hear about properties constantly. Every acquisition, every renovation, every sale, they were the rhythm of our life together. Marcus talked about his work the way other people talk about the weather, constantly, casually, as if there was nothing worth concealing, but I had never heard of Ashworth Road. I pulled out my phone and searched the address. A large detached house on the edge of a village about 40 minutes outside the city. According to the property listings I found, it had been sold 8 months ago for just over £800,000. £800,000 for a house I had never heard of. I took a photograph of the screen with my phone. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I thought I should be shaking. But something in me had gone very quiet and very still, like an animal that senses danger and freezes. I took the photograph. I closed the study door. I went back to the kitchen. I made tea. And I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall and thought very carefully about what to do next. I did not confront Marcus that night. Not yet, because I understood even in those first disorienting minutes that if something was wrong, if something was being hidden, then my greatest advantage was that he did not know I knew. And I intended to keep that advantage for as long as I possibly could, over the next 3 weeks. I became a different person. On the surface, nothing changed. I came home at the same times. I cooked dinner. I asked about his day. I laughed at his jokes. I lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe and thought about what I might be lying next to, what version of Marcus existed beneath the one I had married. But underneath the surface, I was working. I started paying attention to the financial details of our life in a way I never had before. I had always been content to let Marcus handle the money, not because I was naive. Exactly, but because he was the one who understood it, who had built his career around it, and I had trusted him completely. Now I began to look. Our joint account, which we used for household expenses, was normal. Regular deposits, regular outgoings, nothing unusual. But Marcus also had a business account that I had access to in theory, but had never examined closely. I began to look at that too, and what I found there was a version of our financial life that I didn't recognize at all. There were transfers, regular, substantial, to an account I couldn't identify. There were invoices from companies I couldn't trace. There were payments described in terms so vague as to be meaningless. And running through all of it, like a thread I couldn't quite pull loose, was a pattern of movement that suggested Marcus had been operating a parallel financial life for years, one that I had been entirely excluded from. I didn't understand all of it yet. I am not an accountant. I'm not a solicitor. But I understood enough to know that whatever Marcus had been doing, it was significant. And whatever it was, he had gone to considerable lengths to make sure I didn't see it. I made copies of everything I could access. I saved documents. I wrote notes. I created a folder on a cloud account Marcus didn't know about, and I put everything there, organized carefully, dated meticulously, and then very quietly. I started looking for a lawyer. The lawyer I found was a woman named Patricia Okafor. She had been recommended to me by a colleague at work, not in the context of my situation, just casually mentioned as someone exceptional. I called her office from the car park outside a coffee shop 3 weeks after I found the email, sitting in my car with my coat still on. Having told Marcus I was meeting a friend for lunch, Patricia was calm and direct and immediately impressive. When I laid out what I had found, the email, the unfamiliar property, the financial transfers, the companies I couldn't trace, she listened without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, Mrs. Calloway, I think you need to understand that what you're describing, if it is what I think it may be, is serious. And I think you need to stop collecting information on your own and let me take it from here. I asked her what she thought it might be. She said she didn't want to speculate. But she said it twice, the word serious, and both times she said it in the same careful tone. And I understood that she was not overstating it. I want to tell you about the next 6 weeks, because they were the strangest of my life. I continued living with Marcus as if nothing had changed. I continued being his wife in every outward sense. I cooked and cleaned and attended dinner, parties, and smiled at his colleagues and said all the right things at all the right moments. And all the while, Patricia and her team were working quietly, methodically, through the information I had given them, tracing the financial threads, identifying the companies, mapping the movement of money, living like that, divided between the performance of normal life and the reality of what was happening beneath it, does something to you that I find difficult to describe even now. It is exhausting in a way that goes deeper than tiredness. It is lonely in a way that goes deeper than solitude. Because you cannot talk to anyone. You cannot share the weight of what you know with anyone who loves you. Because the moment you do, it becomes real in a way that cannot be taken back. And you are not ready for it to be real yet. You are still in the gathering phase. The quiet, careful, holding your breath phase. I thought about my mother often during those weeks. She had always said that the hardest part of any difficult thing is the waiting, the period between knowing something is wrong and being able to do something about it. She was right. It was, but I held on. Because I had a daughter to think about. Her name is Rosie. She was 3 years old then, with her father's dark hair and my stubbornness and a laugh that could recalibrate an entire room. She was the reason I moved carefully. The reason I did not simply explode the moment I found that email. The reason I sat in that lawyer's office and thought long-term and strategic. Instead of just broken and furious. Rosie changed everything about how I approached those weeks. Not what I was fighting for, that was always justice. But how I fought for it. The call from Patricia came on a Thursday afternoon in early December. I was at my desk at work. My phone buzzed and I saw her name and I felt my entire body go still. She said, Nadia, are you somewhere private? I went to the stairwell. What she told me over the next 30 minutes dismantled everything I thought I knew about my marriage. I am going to try to explain it to you clearly, though even now it is difficult to compress into simple language. Because what Marcus had been doing was deliberately complex, deliberately layered, designed to be difficult to follow. Marcus had been running a separate property company, not his main business, but a parallel one, set up in the name of a nominee director who was, in reality, a close friend. Through this company, over the course of our 4-year marriage, he had acquired and sold 7 properties. Properties that had never appeared in any documents I had access to. properties whose profits had never entered any account I knew about. The total value of those transactions was, as near as Patricia could determine at that stage, somewhere in the region of £2.4 million. £2.4 million. I repeated the number in the stairwell with no one to hear me. £2.4 million that had passed through a company I did not know existed, managed by a director whose name I did not recognize, generating profits that had never been disclosed to me in any form. And why did this matter beyond the sheer scale of it? It mattered because we were married. It mattered because, under the law, marital assets minus assets acquired during the course of a marriage are subject to division in the event of divorce. And Marcus had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that these particular assets would not be visible as marital assets. To ensure that if our marriage ever ended, these millions would remain entirely his. He had been planning for the possibility of our marriage ending since before it had properly begun. Patricia said, very gently, Nadia, I need to ask you something. And I need you to think carefully before you answer. Is there any possibility that Marcus knows you've been looking into this? I said I didn't think so. I had been so careful, she said. Okay, good. Then we have a window. And we need to use it wisely. I went home that evening and made pasta for dinner. I set the table. I lit the candles we kept in the center. I called Rosie in from the garden and wiped her hands and settled her into her chair. And I sat across from the man I had married and watched him eat and talk about his day and pour himself a glass of wine. And I thought, you have no idea, it is a strange and terrible power. Knowing something that the other person doesn't know you know. I don't say that with pride. I say it with the heaviness of someone who understands that the moments just before everything changes have a particular weight to them. A particular texture. They feel suspended. Out of time. Like the last seconds before a storm breaks. 2 days later, the storm broke. I don't know to this day exactly how he found out. Patricia's team had been meticulous. My own movements had been careful. But Marcus had his own sources, people who operated in the same legal and financial world he did. People who might have noticed inquiries being made, searches being run, whatever the mechanism. He knew. I came home on a Saturday evening. I had been at my parents' house with Rosie, and when I turned the key in the front door and stepped into the hallway, I knew immediately that something was different. The house felt different, pressurized, like the air inside it had changed. Marcus was standing in the living room. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand. His jaw was set in a way I recognized from the rare, cold moments of our marriage when something had not gone according to his plan. He said, "Where have you been?" I said I had been at my parents'. He said, "I know what you've been doing, Nadia." And there it was. The end of the quiet phase. The end of the waiting. The beginning of something I had been bracing for without fully believing would come. I looked at him for a long moment. I made a decision. I said, "I know what you've been doing too, Marcus." The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. And then his face changed in a way I can only describe as the mask coming off. Not in rage. Marcus was never a man who raged. That was part of what made him dangerous. He became very still. Very controlled. Like a door closing, he said, "You need to leave this house tonight." I sighed. "This is my home," he said. "Nothing in this house is yours. Everything you see, everything you think you have, it's mine. Has always been mine. Get out, get Rosie and go. Or I'll have you removed, asterisk, I want to pause here. Because I want you to understand something, in that moment." With those words hanging in the air between us, everything I had prepared myself for, all the rational thinking, all the careful planning, all the months of steeling myself, none of it mattered. Because the rational self falls away when the person who was supposed to love you most looks at you with that kind of cold indifference and tells you to leave. Something in me just broke, not permanently, not irreparably, but in the moment, yes. Something broke, because behind all the evidence and the lawyer's calls and the copid documents and the quiet strategic thinking, there had still been a part of me, a stubborn, hoping, deeply human part that had wanted there to be an explanation. that had wanted him to say something that would make it make sense. That had wanted, even in the face of everything, to be wrong. And when he told me to get out, I understood that there was no other explanation. There was no mistake. There was no misunderstanding. This was simply who Marcus was, and I had spent 4 years married to a person I never truly knew. Asterisk. I packed 2 bags. I took Rosie, who was confused and kept asking where we were going. And I said we were having a sleepover at Grandma's. I took the folder I had prepared, the documents, the photographs, the notes, which I had kept not in the house but in a locked box at my office. I took my passport and Rosie's passport and the small amount of emergency cash I had been quietly building for 3 months. I walked out of that house with my daughter on my hip and my bag over my shoulder, and behind me, the door closed. I stood on the pavement in the cold December air and I looked up at the sky and I thought, this is the lowest point. This is the worst this will ever be. Because from here, there is only forward. I believed that dot and that belief, fragile and battered as it was the thing that carried me through the next hours. The drive to my parents. My mother opening the door and seeing my face and not needing any words. My father making tea silently because he didn't know what to say but needed to do something. Rosie falling asleep in the spare room, confused but unafraid. Because children take their cues from the adults around them. And I had held myself together until she was safely unconscious. And then I sat at my parents' kitchen table at midnight. And I called Patricia, and I said, he knows. He threw us out. I have everything. What do we do now? And she said, without hesitation, now we begin. Asterisk. The months that followed were the hardest and the most transformative of my life. They were hard in ways. I anticipated the legal proceedings, which were extensive and expensive and slow. The strain of explaining to Rosie in age-appropriate terms why Daddy and Mummy were not living together anymore. The exhaustion of rebuilding a life from what felt like rubble. And they were hard in ways I did not anticipate. The grief. Because even when the person who hurt you is someone who deserved to be left, you still mourn the version of them you thought you knew. You mourn the life you thought you were living. You mourn the future you had planned with someone who turned out to be, in significant respects, a fiction. I cried more in those months than I had cried in my entire life combined. I cried in the car. I cried in the shower. I cried quietly with my face in a pillow in the spare room at my parents' house so that Rosie wouldn't hear. I cried because I was furious. I cried because I was frightened. I cried because I was lonely in a way I hadn't known it was possible to be. And sometimes, this is the part that surprised me most. I cried simply because I was sad. Not angry. Not betrayed. Just sad. Sad that it had been this. Sad that the man I had married had chosen deception over honesty, strategy over love. Sad that Rosie would grow up with a father who was capable of doing what he had done. Sad that the house by the river, with its high ceilings and original fireplaces and walled garden, the house I had genuinely come to love, was a place I could not go back to. Grief and anger are not opposites. You can hold them both at the same time. You can be furious at what someone did to you and still grieve the loss of what you thought you had. I want to say that clearly. Because nobody told me it was allowed. Nobody told me I was permitted to be sad about losing a marriage where I had been deceived. I had to figure out for myself that the sadness was not weakness. And it was not confusion, and it was not some indication that I should have stayed. It was simply human. And it was mine. Patricia was extraordinary. Over the following 4 months, her team built a case that was, in her words, unusually well evidenced. The documents I had copied, the photographs I had taken, the notes I had kept, combined with the financial investigation her team conducted, created a picture that was difficult for Marcus's legal team to dispute in any substantive way. What they tried instead was character. This is something Patricia had warned me about. When the facts are against someone, she told me early on, they often go after the person instead. They try to make the argument about who you are, rather than what they did. They try to reframe the narrative. Marcus's legal team tried to paint me as unstable, paranoid, a woman who had secretly and obsessively surveilled her own husband because of jealousy or mental fragility. They submitted statements from two of Marcus's colleagues, people I had considered mutual friends, describing incidents that either had not happened or had been distorted beyond recognition. I sat in meetings listening to these descriptions of myself, this frightened, irrational woman who had invented a conspiracy, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, not rage. Not despair. Clarity. Because the more they tried to reshape me into something diminished, the more certain I became of exactly who I was and what I knew. You cannot be gaslit when you have the receipts. You cannot be made to doubt yourself when you have the documents, the photographs, the bank records, the paper trail. You cannot be convinced you imagined something. When you held the evidence in your own hands, I let them say what they needed to say. And then Patricia laid out the evidence. Piece by piece, methodically, precisely, like a building being constructed from the foundation up. The settlement took 7 months to reach. I will not describe every legal detail here, because the details are complex and, in some ways, less important than what they meant. What I will tell you is this: the £2.4 million in concealed assets was identified, valued, and included in the marital estate. The house on the north side of the city, the one Marcus had built before we met, the one he had told me was entirely his, was determined, in part, to have been improved and maintained during our marriage, including through my financial contributions to the household that had freed his money for other uses. This was factored into the settlement. By the time the proceedings concluded, what I received was enough. More than enough, in practical terms. Enough to buy a home of our own for Rosie and me. Enough to have security. Enough to breathe. I remember the day I got the call from Patricia telling me the final settlement had been agreed. I was standing in the kitchen of my parents' house, washing up after dinner. The water was still running. I turned it off. I said thank you. I hung up the phone. And then I slid down the kitchen cabinet until I was sitting on the floor. And I pressed my hands flat against the cold tiles and I just stayed there for a while. Not crying. Not triumphant. Just present. Just breathing. Just allowing myself to exist in the space that had just opened up. My mother found me a few minutes later. She didn't ask what had happened. She just sat down on the floor next to me, which for a 60-year-old woman with bad knees is no small thing. She sat beside me on the kitchen floor and she put her arm around me and we sat there together in the quiet. She said, "Nadia, it's over." I said, "I know," she said. "Your grandfather would have been so proud of you." And that, somehow, was the thing that broke open the last locked room inside me. I cried then, not the quiet, careful crying of the previous months, but the deep, releasing kind. The kind that empties something out and leaves space for something new. I want to tell you what happened to Marcus. Not because I want to dwell in his consequences, but because I think the truth matters. I think people deserve to know that actions have weight. That choices land somewhere, eventually. The legal proceedings had included, unavoidably, disclosures about the concealed company and the pattern of transactions. Some of those disclosures were of interest to parties beyond our divorce lawyers. I did not report Marcus to any regulatory body. I did not need to. The information, once in the legal record, moved through its proper channels without any action on my part. There were professional consequences. There were reputational consequences in the industry where he had built his career on the appearance of integrity. There were financial consequences, beyond what the settlement had already cost him. I won't pretend I felt nothing when I heard about these things. I did feel something. Not satisfaction exactly. That is too clean a word for what it was. More like a kind of acknowledgement. A confirmation from the universe that what had been done was real, and that it mattered, and that it had not gone unnoticed. But I tried not to spend too much time there. Because one of the things I learned in those 7 months is that justice, when it comes, tends to arrive quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't provide the dramatic reckoning you imagined in your lowest moments. It is more often a slow, unremarkable settling, a shifting of weight from one side of a scale to another, barely visible to anyone not looking closely, and it is enough. It has to be enough. Because if you spend your life waiting for the moment of visible reckoning, you miss the life that is happening around you in the meantime. I found the house on a Tuesday in March. It was smaller than what I had been used to. A 3-bedroom, semi-detached at the end of a quiet street, with a narrow garden and a kitchen that needed new tiles and a bathroom that had last been renovated somewhere in the 1990s. It needed work. It was nothing like the Victorian terrace with its high ceilings and original fireplaces. But when Rosie ran through the back door into the garden and turned around with her arms out and her face tipped up to the sky, laughing at nothing in particular, just laughing because she was 4 years old and running in a garden in March, when I saw that, I thought, yes, this is it, this is the one. We moved in on a bright April morning. My father and brother carried boxes. My mother organized the kitchen. My sister Lily kept Rosie occupied in the garden so that the adults could work. By evening, the beds were made and the kettle was plugged in and there was pasta on the table, just like there had been on the night Marcus told me he knew. But this time, it was just Rosie and me, and my family around us. And the feeling, which I had worried might never come back, of being exactly where I was supposed to be. Rosie fell asleep on the sofa at 7:30, worn out from the excitement of the day. I carried her to her bed, which my mother had made up with her favorite blanket. I tucked her in. I watched her sleep for a moment, this small, perfect person who had kept me moving on the nights when I might otherwise have stopped. Then I went downstairs, and I stood in the kitchen of my house, and I made tea. And I sat at the table. And I was quiet for a long time. I want to speak to you now, directly. Not as a narrator. Not from behind the story. But as a person who lived this, and who came out the other side, and who has thought very carefully about what it means, and what it asks of those of us who carry it. If you are in a moment right now where someone has thrown you away, where someone who was supposed to love you has looked at you like you are disposable, like you are less than, like you are something to be removed from their life, I want you to hear me. Being discarded is not evidence of your worth. It is evidence of theirs. People do not throw away things that don't matter to them. People throw away things that threaten them. Things that know too much. Things that see them clearly. Things that, by simply existing and asking honest questions, reveal something about themselves they are not prepared to face. Marcus threw me out not because I was nothing. He threw me out because I was something close to the truth. Something that saw through the construction. Something he could not continue to deceive once. I had started looking clearly, and that is the thing I want you to carry with you, whatever your version of this story is. Whatever door has been closed in your face. Whatever you have been told about yourself by someone who needed you to be small in order for them to stay comfortable. Your noticing is not a flaw. Your asking questions is not a crime. Your refusal to accept a story that doesn't add up is not paranoia. It is intelligence. It is integrity. It is the deepest form of self-respect. Hold on to it. There is one more thing I want to tell you. About 6 months after I moved into the house on the quiet street, I was going through some old boxes, the ones I had packed hurriedly from my parents' house. The ones that had sat unopened in the corner of the spare room because I hadn't been ready to face them yet. In one of them, I found a photograph. It was from our wedding. Marcus and I at the altar. I looked young in it. I was young in it, 24 years old, in a dress I had agonized over for months. And I was looking at Marcus. And my face was so open. So completely and totally open. No guard, no reservation. No armor, just this young woman looking at a man she loved completely. With every piece of herself available and visible and given. I sat on the floor and I looked at that photograph for a long time, and I want to tell you what I felt when I looked at it. Not what I expected to feel. Bitterness, maybe, or grief. Or the kind of self-directed anger that asks how you could have been so foolish. Not that. I felt something closer to tenderness, for that young woman. For the completeness of her love. For the courage of it, because it is a form of courage, loving someone without reservation. Giving yourself over to another person, with that kind of openness. It is not naivety. It is not stupidity. It is one of the bravest things a human being can do. What happened to her was not her fault. Not for loving openly. Not for trusting. Not for failing to see in the early years what was being carefully concealed from her. She was not wrong to love. She was simply loved wrongly in return, and she survived it. She found her way out. She gathered her evidence and she kept her nerve and she held herself together for her daughter, and she built something new from the rubble of what had been destroyed. She is still here. My name is Nadia. I was thrown out like garbage. I was told I owned nothing. That I had nothing. That I was nothing. And I want to tell you where I am now. Not to triumph. Not to score points. But because the ending matters. The ending is the part that nobody shows you in the early days. When you are on the pavement in the cold with your bag in your hand, and your heart in pieces, and you cannot imagine what forward even looks like from here. I am in a house that is mine. On a quiet street where Rosie knows every neighbor's name and rides her bike in the evenings and has a bedroom painted the exact shade of yellow she chose herself. I have work that I am good at and proud of. I have friends who know the real story and love me anyway. I have my parents, who sat beside me on kitchen floors and made tea at midnight and never, not once, asked me to be anything other than exactly who I was. I have a life that is smaller in some ways than the one I had before, and larger in every way that matters. And every morning, when I open the door of my house and step outside into whatever weather the day has brought, I feel something I couldn't have named on the night Marcus told me to leave. I feel free. Not the absence of something kind of free. Not the relief of escaping. But the active, present, awake kind of free that comes from knowing exactly who you are. From having been tested and from having held. From understanding at a cellular level that you are capable of things you never had to know you were capable of until you needed to be. They threw me out like garbage. And then the truth came out. And the truth turned out to be this. I was never the garbage. I was the one who knew where it was buried.